We all gathered here today, and I thank you all for gathering here today. A few acknowledgements before I begin my remarks. Certainly to Bridget O'Connor, Jack's wife. Happy to see you here as always. Her children, Green O'Connor, Bridget's daughter, Anne Marie and Stephen Schott, with their children, Maple's sister and brother-in-law, Grace and Hal Berman, Maple's sister and brother-in-law. A special thanks to New York City Council member Eric Ulrich, who along with the Community Council for this area put the motion forward that is allowing us to name this place, this street, after Jack. Jack, in case you were not aware, grew up in the house with the little American flag directly to my left and to your right. That's where we used to hang out and run around this park, the little park directly across the street. I think as you're all aware, Jack's son Brendan is a recent graduate of our police academy, now assigned to the 7th precinct. I should also note that for a moment today that we remembered two other New York's finest. Last year on this date, we lost police officer Michael Williams, a tragic auto accident. And a few years back, we also lost police officer Irma Lozada. There are many, many members of the Transit Police Department who are here today, and I think they all remember her death, the first death of a woman police officer assigned to the Transit Police that then set the Transit Police Department on September 21st, 1984. So as we think about Jack, I ask that you also think on this day about those two members of the department. There's so much I could say about Jack, so many stories to tell. I think like all of you, miss him every day. Miss the personality, the humor, the toughness, the character. And it's safe to say that when they made Jack, they broke the mold, and there'll never be another one. He was truly one of a kind. And all of us are fortunate to have known him, and the city is very fortunate for the time he spent growing up here in this city, but most importantly, time he spent as a police officer for this city and for this department. I'd like to, from his book, Crime Fighter, and this is a wonderful, wonderful picture of Jack with those crazy welder sunglasses, the bowler hat, the double-breasted blazer, the bow tie. Mayor Dinkins today in his sartorial splendor is wearing a bow tie in honor of Jack. If I could, let me read from Jack's book for just a moment. Growing up, I had never been one of the kids with the big box of crayons. In the Christmas programs, I never played Joseph. I was the beast in the manger. In SRA, me and Philip A. would be laboring over the reading exercises with the brown band on top when everybody else was on Aqua. Sunday nights were the worst. Every week, I'd get the same sick feeling in my stomach at 8 o'clock. When Ed Sullivan came on, it meant the weekend was over. Everybody was going to have their book reports ready in the morning, except me. My father worked for the post office, and my mother, after she'd raised 7 kids, worked as a nurse's aide at a hospital a few miles from the block where I grew up in Richmond Hill, Queens. Like any other older son in any other civil service family, I was kicked out of bed every Saturday morning when I was almost 16 to take the test for the fire department, the post office, the police, and transit. The NYPD called once when I was still in high school, and the second time when I was ready to join. But I was one of 100 recruits who read in the newspapers the weekend before we were to be sworn in that Mayor John Lindsay had put a freeze on hiring. Transit was not affected by that freeze. By 20, I'd been on the job 2 years, was already married, had a mortgage on a house in Queens, and I wasn't even a full officer yet. Had arrived at 21. From day one as a New York City Transit Police officer, I loved the crime-fighting part of the job. If there's 2 words that describe Jack Maple, the epitome of all he was, is those 2 words, crime fighter. Crime fighter like any other before or since. I had no idea how little I knew. Within a year, I had run up too close to a guy who was swinging a 4-foot iron pipe as he chased another cop down a Brooklyn platform. I took a crack in the skull and was down on the ground about to catch another when I let off 5 rounds and blacked out. A 3rd cop fired at the suspect too, and one of our bullets proved fatal. We never were told whose. 14 months later, working in plain clothes in Manhattan, I bought some pot from a dealer near Bryant Park, and when I went to arrest him, he took my gun. 2 shots were fired so close to my face that my cheek was burned by the muzzle flash. But as we were rolling around, and I was about to give up, I found the trigger again and squeezed it. The barrel, luckily, was pointed at the dealer, and he fell off me wounded, although not wounded badly enough to stop beating me. Not all of the hard lessons in those early years were life and death matters. Testifying at a pretrial hearing in Queens one day, I was asked by a defense attorney how I could remember if I'd advised the defendant of each and every one of the Miranda rights. I read them off an arrest sheet, I answered. And how can you be sure all of them were on the arrest sheet, the lawyer asked. I couldn't be sure, so the defendant's statement was squashed. But I went home, memorized the Miranda warnings, and recited them from memory to every other suspect I ever questioned. Thought I'd repeat that story about Jack because it really reflected that Jack was a cop through and through. Life and death experiences from early times on the job, but also an appreciation of the importance of the law in terms of going by the law, that Miranda warning that had to be read every time. The second story from the book that I'd like to relate, and he's not here, Louis Anemone, because the doctor's appointment that he could not change is not here. I just spoke to him on the phone, but I wanted to read from chapter 11 of Jack's book, because he talks about Louis Anemone. And Louis, along with Jack, as we all know, was so instrumental in not only creating but driving the Comstat initiative that was so instrumental in saving the city. And he reads, in the perfect world, everybody would be Louis Anemone. I know what you're thinking. We really want to live in a world where everybody works 7 days a week, 365 days a year. Only chiefs of the department can understand that, along with many of the brass here. We really want everybody to dress like George Patton, 24 hours a day, even when they go to bed. We really want to live in constant anxiety that anybody we have the wrong answer for will scald their temples or curl the wallpaper with the steam that comes out of their ears. Fair enough. Maybe there are some characteristics we want to clone from the NYPD legendary chief of the department. The charm school dropout I referred to at the beginning of chapter 4 as the most valuable player on the nation's largest police force back then in 1994. Well, we would want every cop and every citizen to have at least some Louis in them. Jack Maple certainly had a lot of Louis in him. We would want them to be equipped with essentially the same pile of information that Louis had in front of him every time he calls a crime meeting to order at Comstat. We'd want them to at least be somewhat fluent in interpreting patterns, trends, and chronic conditions of any crime act. We want most of all for them to be as relentless in their demand for neighborhoods and communities free of crime. Anemone brings to mind another Lou, who wore a New York uniform, the Yankees' Iron Horse, Lou Gehrig. More than 3 years after Bill Bratton, John Timoney, and I moved on to other things, and about 4 years after the press began declaring victory over crime in New York City, Louis Anemone was still pushing the cops of the NYPD to be a little better every day, to catch a few more crooks, to save a few more lives. When retirement finally beckoned Louis in 1999, New York was fortunate that another thoroughbred, Joe Dunn, was there to assume Louis' chair. He was succeeded by Joe Esposito, and now he's been succeeded by Jimmy O'Neill. I relate those stories from the book because it's the essence of what Jack was about: professionalism, about the use of information. To Jack, every one of those dots on a crime map was a life that could have been saved, a life that could have been spared from a rape or a robbery. One of my favorite stories of Comstat was sitting beside him in the early days, and he puts up the map, and on the map shows a housing development. There's a lot of crime. And he puts up the complaints that were coming in about drugs in that neighborhood, and a lot of the complaints were coming from that housing development. And then he wanted to put up on the map where were the arrests being made by the drug unit. And all those dots went up on the map, and the dots were over here. They weren't where the complaints were coming from. And Jack was questioning the detective, why are you over there when the complaints are over here? And the detective said, well, it's very dangerous over there. Can you imagine? Can you imagine? Jack, with smoke coming out of his ears, said, can you imagine how dangerous it is for that 65-year-old woman with her arms full of bags from shopping to go in and out of that building every day? And you, a New York City cop, with your gun and your badge, you're afraid to go there too. That was the essence of Jack Maple. We had to be where the crime was. We had to be where the criminals were. because that's what we as cops do. Let me close with a note of levity about Jack, that God knows we all have stories about him, a lot of fun with him. One of my favorites is that when I was still chief of the transit police and got to wear a uniform back in those days, and over 20 pounds ago, and the hair was a lot darker than it is now. And I looked pretty good in the uniform, and had quite a striking figure with my 4 stars and my hat. And Jack and I are on one of our tours, and we're walking through Grand Central Terminal. And Jack's beside me with his usual two-tone shoes, the bowler hat, the bow tie, the double-breasted blazer. And a little more rotund in those days, that used to carry a few pounds, but those pounds were all muscle and not fat, because anybody that ran across them the wrong way could soon learn. And as we're moving across the Grand Central Terminal, over by the clock, coming toward us is one of the homeless characters that were very frequently in residence in those days. And as he staggers toward us, and he looks up, and he stops. He looks at us as we walk by, and we look at him, and he says, "Hey," and we stop. And he says, "Me? You know who you look like?" And I said, "No, who?" He says, "MacArthur." I puffed up my chest, I'm feeling pretty good. He turns to Maple, and he points at Maple and looks him up and down and says, "You know who you look like?" And Jack says, "No, who?" And he says, "Winston Churchill." So Jack, that was one of Jack's heroes, Winston Churchill. Two of us are all set to walk off, kind of puffed up by this accolade from this denizen of Grand Central, when behind us we hear, "No, wait a minute." And we turn, and he turns back to us, and he points at Jack, and he says, "No, not Winston Churchill, Batty Arbuckle." Talk about a deflate. Jack just about melted in the ground. I had to hold him back from going over and killing the guy. That was the Jacks that tried and true. That those of you who don't know Jack and only hear stories of him really cannot understand the fun we had with him, but also how much we learned from him. And I'm so pleased that the council and the community council here has deemed it fitting to basically erect a sign that we and the family are unveil in the moment. A more appropriate location would probably be in Times Square, where Jack spent so much of his time, and where so much of the turnaround of the city is most evident. Jack, many of the stories he tells about in his book were his times as a transit cop following the bowels of Times Square. And the last story. Jack and I, one evening, beautiful, beautiful fall evening like this, we decided to walk home. We were living up in Central Park South. Imagine a kid from Queens and me, a kid from Cold Rock, Flat, Dorchester, living on Central Park South, across from Central Park, but we had made it. And we were going to walk home from police headquarters, and we did. And we walked Broadway, just to see the changes and talk about it, the excitement of us, these two kids. He's the son of a postal worker, I'm the son of a postal worker. And here we are running the most famous police department in America. Who would have ever thought it? And when we walked into Times Square and we looked around, and Jack looked up at Father Duffy and the statue, and Jack said, "This is amazing, boss, huh? This is amazing about the changes." And I said, "Jack, someday they'll probably put a statue of you up in the square." And Jack said, "No, I wouldn't want to have all those pigeons sitting on my head." But no, Jack, we got it when we took that long walk. We walked through a city that had been transformed because of men and women like Jack Maple, the men and women of the NYPD, transit police who preceded them, who had committed, instances like the officers I remembered earlier, who had given their lives for the city. In some respects, Jack gave his life for the city too, because he spent his life focused on saving it. And we should all remember that he accomplished that. He saved New York City. Thank you.
And thank you so much, Commissioner Bratton. And I'd like to introduce New York City Council member,